Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Redemption Thursdays with Rabbi Pinchas Winston of Telstone, Israel. World-renowned Torah teacher, scholar, writer, lecturer from Telstone. Visit his website, please, at 36.org. You see it under his name, 36, the whole word. You'll have so many books and videos and writings to choose from to read anything from Jewish history to Mashiach, our topic that we love to talk about on Thursday nights here. Brought to you by IsraelTorah.org, BringThemHome.org, and the Miriam Project Geula Hour. Here's a couple of his recent books: The Highest Knowledge Ever, Estimated Time of Arrival of Mashiach. I recommend all of them very highly. And thank you so much for joining us, Rabbi Winston.
And now Happiness Please also is a new one.
Oh, I didn't get that one yet. I'm ready. I'm waiting.
No, it's on the way. It's on the way.
Okay, thank you.
I'll have to press. Okay, we're changing the topic a bit right now because we just finished Shavuos and it's moving. We have a little bit of a breather right now, but we're moving now towards the Ben HaMetzarim period, the 3 weeks that begin with Yud Zayin Tammuz, the fast of Yud Zayin Tammuz, that then ends with Tisha B'Av, 3 weeks exactly, from day to day. And it's for a lot of people that are not even aware of the period of time, especially if people are not religious. It's not, Tisha B'Av doesn't really have much importance, doesn't really get celebrated or at least observed that much, and the 3 weeks themselves. And even for some people religious, they might be aware of it, but it's very hard to cope with the period of time because of all the restrictions. Not really that many restrictions. Only the last 9 days is when it gets kind of tense and more serious because we're approaching Tisha B'Av, because Tisha B'Av, of course, is the day that a lot of things happened. A lot of things went wrong, specifically the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash and apparently the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash. Not a coincidence, we're told, because it's built into the Bria. It's, we don't really have such a good appreciation of how history works unless you're in Kabbalah, unless you understand these things. But there's even the Midrashim. A lot of Midrashim at least allude to the rules of history and how they work and how everything taking place in history is really a function of things going back not only to Ma'aseh Bereshis, but even before Ma'aseh Bereshis. What was before Ma'aseh Bereshis? I mean, you open the Chumash. The Chumash begins with the letter Beis. And the Medrash asks, why does it begin with the letter Beis? And not all of, there's a lot of Midrashim about this. And one of the main reasons why is because the Beis, is shaped like this, and it's closed to the right and open to the left. To say whatever comes after is an open book. That's the Chumash. That's the Chamisha Chumshei Torah, the 5 books of Moshe. That's available to everybody. Anyone can read that. You don't have to be a scholar to learn that. Whatever came before is kind of off limits, or at least it's not part of the Chumash. That's not entirely true, but that's what the Medrash says. And it was many, many years. I mean, for the longest time, I thought that's all there was. I didn't really, God said, Bereshis, B'Elokim Hashemayim V'Haaretz. And that was it. In the beginning, God made the heavens and the earth. That was the starting point of everything. What happened before that, only God knows. But it turns out that we also know what happened before that, because the story of creation in the Chumash is really like walking into the movie a good hour into the film. You're cutting into the middle of it and picking up the story where you happen to begin. But there's so much backstory, there's so much going on. And that's the Kabbalah. That's what Kabbalah deals with. My Rebbe, who I used to learn from Kabbalah from, who once told us that everything, all of Torah begins with the base. Kabbalah basically deals with what happened before Ma'aseh Bereshis, in advance of the 6 days of creation. And if you open the Zohar, especially the particular sections, Idra Rabbah, Zuta, Sifnei Snusa, what else is there? There's one more, just slipping my mind for the time being. But anyway, these forums specifically, they detail in explicit and exquisite detail of what actually took place in advance of the 6 days of creation to get to the 6 days of creation. Well down the road. There's lots going on before and advance of that. And it's like a gardener. It's like there's a famous story of a person who once, it's a medrash, not a true story necessarily, but the person saw he watched the farmer plant the seeds into. First he hoed the ground. First he broke the ground up with his hoe and his cow and all that, and then he planted the seeds, and the seeds begin to grow, and eventually they grow into nice stalks of wheat, and they're beautiful stalks of wheat. And then the person comes along and he cuts them down, and he says, "I don't understand. What was the point of that? You did all this work, all this effort to produce something, and then you just cut it down." He said, "We're not finished yet. Come with me." And he takes them into the barn where they take the wheat and they grind it down and to make flour. And he says, "But I'm still, it's even more broken down now. Now it's dust." He said, "We're still not finished yet." And he baked him bread. He gave him a taste of the bread. It's a medrash, obviously. He gave him a taste of the bread, and he said, "Wow, this is delicious." And he understood at that point in time why everything had a whole process that began with breaking the ground in the beginning to make it soft and easy to put the seed into the ground so that it should grow, until you basically had bread. That bread was the end result of the whole point, but it's not apparent at the beginning. I always wonder who the first people to figure these things out. The truth is, the Gemara says that Adam Arishon, he was the one who figured out how to make bread the first time, and but all those other recipes they come up with, who figures these things out? Who ever thought that to use eggs to cook them and make delicious eggs? But anyhow, the point is that the end result. That's what shows us what everything was about from the beginning, because there's so many things along the way. In a sense, like the Holocaust, for example, is like cutting down the wheat in a much more serious and frightening way. But it goes back to my Bereshis. But the truth is that it doesn't go back to the planting the seed. There first had to be seeds that grew. There had to be the ground. There had to be the dirt. There's a long, ongoing process that things going on below the ground. You don't even see for the longest time. Put the seed in the ground, and it starts to decay and all that, and eventually becomes the flour that becomes the food. But that's how history works too. And the Medrash says there had to be a Haman, there had to be a Mordechai, there had to be a Achashverosh, there had to be a Noach, there had to be a Mabul, there had to be an Avraham, there had to be a Nimrod, there had to be a this, there had to be a that. Everything had to be. It was all pre-written, which means that everything was put in the foundation way back before God even said Bereshis, but Elokim Shemayim v'Haaretz. That's already like fixing things up. That's why it's called Tikkun Ma'aseh Bereshis, which means that the rectification of not just Ma'aseh Bereshis, not just the act of creating, but Tikkun Ma'aseh Bereshis. It's a fixing of something. So of what? Of whatever was broken before that. Because according to Kabbalah, there's a concept called Shvir Kelim, the breaking of the vessels, which is the basis of all that goes wrong. And anything that breaks, Moshe broke the tablets, right? Coming down the mountain. He broke those tablets. That's a function of Shvir Kelim, a pre-creation reality that God himself did for the sake of making evil possible, so that free will could be possible, that we could earn our schar in Olam Haba and Olam Hazeh, this world, the next world. It's all part of nothing's out of control. Nothing wasn't calculated. Human being, it's amazing, first of all, what we can calculate. It's amazing how much we can project and we can assume and prepare and make possible. Absolutely amazing. We make mistakes still. Things still go wrong. We can't think of everything. If you had a prophet, then maybe you could figure these things out in advance and know what not to do. I think the Ramban says in the time of prophecy, you brought your children to a prophet to find out how to raise them, because everyone knows that raising children is a big question mark. Each one has a different nature, and that nature is not quite visible in the beginning. And as they grow older, and there's situations and circumstances that have impact on a child's psyche that we didn't plan for. And we, of course, our own selves, don't know ourselves so well to know how much discipline and how much chesed to give and when to be nice. It's a very confusing thing. So therefore, the prophet, he could tell you what the future of this child was going to be, so you could already in advance know how to raise that child. Today, basically, it's live and learn and make mistakes and hope for the best. As one person once said, that raising children is 75% heavenly help and 25% heavenly help, because that's what you need. You need siyata d'shmaya, help the entire way through. That's not just for raising children, for running businesses, for relationships, marriages, you name it. Everything requires a lot of heavenly help. As one person pointed out, that you don't have a lot of schoolers for things that go well automatically, right? For things that happen naturally, you don't need a schooler. one of the things there's so many schools for in the Jewish people, even amongst those who don't do schools that much, is for shalom bayis, peace in the house, because as the Gemara says, it's like there's a famous medrash about this. It's actually not so famous, but there's a medrash about this, about how basically Cleopatra, but I think it was just a Roman matroness or a wife of a Caesar, something like that. But she asked Rabbi Akiva, "What has your God been doing since he made creation?" Because clearly he did it once and it's over. He hasn't done anything spectacular since then. He's split the sea, maybe, but creation was everything, and now since then he must be bored. What's he doing? She didn't understand that every single second God is redoing Ma'aseh Bereshis. Every single second, from scratch. You can't see it. That's part of the miracle, but that's what we're told. He's not bored. He's always doing it, and anyhow, it's not a big deal from anyhow. But so Rabbi Akiva answered and said he's making shidduchim. He's marrying off people one to the other, right? And that's what God. It's not a big deal. I can do that myself. Watch. And she brings all these male servants in and all these female servants, and she just pairs them out. You with him, you with her, right? She says, that's it. So simple. So why do you need God for that? So the next day it says they came back and they wanted divorces, and this had hit that one, the bruises and crying. Is like it was a mess, an absolute disaster, much worse than divorce court. And she said, now I understand. Now these obviously have a lot of deeper meaning to them, a lot of insights that come from these things. But the point is that shalom bayis is not a simple thing. So therefore you have all these schoolers. And it certainly would help if you had a prophet. Because a prophet, you could take your future. And today, people take their potential shidduch to their Rosh Hashiva to get approval. But as wise as he may be, he's not a prophet, and he doesn't always know for sure. Things change over time, for so many different reasons. So really, you're completely relying upon Hashem to guide you. But the foundation for everything goes back not just to creation itself, because that is the basis of the 6,000 years. That's what we're told. Chazal tell us that the 6,000 years come from the 6 days of creation, that each day of creation is the basis for a millennium. The first day, first millennium. Second day, second millennium. All the way to the 6th day and the 6th millennium, which is our millennium, which we're approaching the end of. And that has tremendous ramifications, which we have spoken about before in the past, about the 10th hour, which corresponds to when Adam Harishon ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and then eventually exiled from the Garden of Eden, and how that corresponds to the internet in our period of history, because everything that grows in history is rooted in the 6 days of creation. The Vilna Gaon says it specifically. In fact, he goes even further. He says, if you understand how that works, then you can figure out the exact arrival of Mashiach. But he says, if you do figure it out, I'm putting an oath on you, you can't tell anybody else. And there have been people who have made the calculation and have held by the oath and have not spilled the beans, or at least their calculations. But it's all built in. It's all built in. And the 6 days of creation themselves are built in. They come from what existed prior, at least at the time of Tikkun Ma'aseh Bereshis, we call the spheres, which is kind of like the cosmic DNA of existence. Completely spiritual reality, nothing physical yet, but the basis of all that's going to ever exist. The toughest thing we have, is to get our minds around, at least my mind around, is how the physical world, which is so physical and even so profane in many cases, can come from something so spiritual like divine light and so holy. Okay, Kabbalah talks about that to some degree. Now, whether we can understand it or not doesn't make a difference. That is the reality, and God told us that's what happened. And this is the concept we call Yesh Ma'ayin. Everyone seems to agree with the idea of Yesh Ma'ayin. The Greeks called it creation ex nihilo, which means from nothing. And even physicists today have reached the conclusion after they thought they got to the bottom line with the Big Bang theory, meaning that everything began with the Big Bang. Everybody knew, except for them for some reason, that the Big Bang had to come from something else. But if it comes from a something else, then where did something else come from? Someone once, I don't know where this came from, it was a joke, a story, but someone said, what made creation? A turtle. And what made the turtle? Another turtle. and that turtle before that. It's turtles all the way down, infinitely down. And there's another way of saying that as long as you're making something and it's coming from something, then the something before the something has to come from something. It's ad infinitum. Well, what's the beginning of it all? We seem to assume that it's, at one point in time, they just thought that the universe was infinite. It was like two parallel lines with not touching at the beginning, not touching at the end. But Hubble, and then later, and Einstein and all the physicists eventually, were able to show how that it's not like parallel lines. There was a beginning, and that's what the Big Bang came from, and the universe is expanding, moving outwards, right? So therefore, there was an original point, which means there was a beginning. So therefore, scientists finally came around and said, by definition, there's something had to have come from nothing. What is nothing? We're not sure yet. We know what it is. I mean, too bad, but I guess it keeps them busy, and you get research grants, and lots of interesting theories. But we know that the nothing is not really nothing. It's only called nothing because compared to something, it's like nothing. Something spiritual as the light of God is so sublime and so abstract that you couldn't see it with your eyes, and if you wanted to, it has to be much more filtered. And therefore, it's called nothing. It's called ayin in Hebrew. The highest levels of divine light are called ayin, which means nothing. But again, it's only nothing compared to the something, but compared to itself, it's the most something there is. In fact, it's more something than the somethings are, because it's the reality of God, and nothing is realer than the reality of God. But the point is that everything is rooted, and everything happens for a specific reason. And that's the reason why, for example, this week is Parshas Behalosecha. Parshas Behalosecha is one parsha before Shlach Lecha. Shlach Lecha next week is the parsha, the seminal parsha, the turning point in Jewish. Even the golden calf was not the same kind of turning point as the spies, the story of the spies. It was the 10th test. Yes, God said, 10, magical number for good and for bad. Enough is enough. You've tested me 10 times. That's it. It's not going to happen. The final redemption is not going to happen. It's going to have to happen much more in the future. So on one hand, it's like, is the point of the spies that it is the 10th test, but not because the spies really is much worse than the golden calf, or is it uniquely a huge mistake, if you can call that, in history, that even though it happens to be the 10th test on its own, it was enough, of course, to begin what has been an ongoing exile for over 3,300 years at this point in time. So what's interesting, when they talk about Tisha B'Av, they talk about the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. Most of the time, they'll talk about how, the first Beis Hamikdash was destroyed because they were doing the three main averas, terrible averas of geula, shvichos damim, and avodah zarah. Those are the three cardinal sins, right? Geula, illicit relationships. Shvichos damim is murder, right? The wanton spilling of blood. And then you have avodah zarah, of course, which is idol worship, and they were doing these things. The Gemara talks about it was so prevalent at that time that a person would serve God in the temple. They believed in God, and they were serving Him in the temple with a idol inside their pouch tucked away. They're doing both at the same time. It's really impossible to comprehend how that could happen. I mean, you can say it, but what kind of mentality allows for both the belief in God and the belief in avodah zarah? Well, that's a discussion unto itself, but that's what they were doing. And geula, shvichos damim, these things. So God destroyed the Beis Hamikdash because it took a long time before He finally did it. The Beis Hamikdash stood for 410 years before it was destroyed, but the first one. But the second Beis Hamikdash, we're told it was destroyed because of sinas chinam. They didn't do the three cardinal sins like the first Beis Hamikdash, but they had, baseless hatred for one another. And that's such a serious sin, believe it or not. It's such an easy one to do. It's so simple to do. I mean, secular, religious, baseless hatred is, part of the problem is because you think it's not baseless. But from God's perspective, it can be very baseless. And that was such a terrible avera that God destroyed the second Beis Hamikdash. And the truth is, the second Beis Hamikdash was not as holy as the first Beis Hamikdash. We didn't have Aron Kodesh. There are 5 major things we're missing, but still, it was the Beis Hamikdash. and there's still an avoda took place inside of it. So it was destroyed because of sin is chinam. But the interesting thing is that you forget that the Gemara already tells you a reason that superseded or preceded these reasons. Like these reasons really are more like the result of a different reason. And what was that reason? The Gemara says that the reason why Tisha B'Av became a day of infamy is because of the fact that the spies came back and delivered their evil report about Eretz Yisrael on Tisha B'Av. They spied the land for 40 days. They came back, and God punished them one day for every day that they're away, right? Which is merciful. 1 year, so 1 year for every day they're away. It was still quite merciful, but in the end, they came back, and when they delivered the report, it happened to be Tisha B'Av, and because God said, and that night they cried. It says they cried what's called bechinas chinam, a crying, a baseless cry. In other words, God's giving you the gift of Eretz Yisrael. You're going to Eretz Yisrael, and this is going to be the fulfillment of the promise to the Avos, to the forefathers, and to Moshe Rabbeinu, and to and even better than that is your own personal fulfillment, because a Jew, no matter how good the learning is in Chutz La'aretz, no matter how good the food is, no matter how well you make Shabbos in Chutz La'aretz, it doesn't make a difference. There's a reason why God separated out Eretz Yisrael from the rest of the lands of the world. There's a reason why God called, even in Europe, even where the Mir Yeshiva was in Poland, it was still called Chul, still called Chutz La'aretz, still called the Makom of Tumah. The Beis Medrash was a holy place in a Makom of Tumah, a place of impurity. In Tuva Aretz, it's brought down that every land has a ministering angel, and over every land, the ministering angel is from the side of impurity. The only angel that's not from the side of impurity is the one over Israel, because it's a Makom Kadosh. It's a holy place. It's the place where a Jew's soul is hewn from, and therefore you cannot achieve completion unless you're near Israel. Period. Even a Gadol Ador. Period. That's just the way it is. In fact, the Gemara makes this point and says that somebody who's righteous, he's doing everything right you can possibly do when it comes to Torah mitzvahs. He's learning full time, and he's doing all the mitzvahs with the proper kavan, the proper Mesiras Nefesh. He's doing it all right. Just one problem: he's stuck in Chutz La'aretz. And the Gemara says, you know what that's called? It's called Ovdei B'Azor B'Tahara. It's called worshiping idols in purity. Purity because he's not really worshiping idols. This Khalili wouldn't be a tzaddik. He's a complete tzaddik. But just the mitzias of being in Chutz La'aretz, the pasuk says, and the Gemara says in Kesuvas, Ki'ilu Eilo Eloka. It's like you have no God. So when the Jewish people chose to stay in the Midbar, they probably thought, well, that doesn't apply to us. Anyhow, the Gemara wasn't written yet, but it doesn't apply to us. Why? Because we have him. He's right here. The Shechina. We have the Machonot, the Shechina and Levium and Israel, and we have the Kav, the clouds of glory. So we don't. It's like really, and at Har Sinai, of course, the mountain had the halachic status of being, Har Maria, the Makom of the temple, the base of Mikdash and Eretz Yisrael. So, we kind of been like portable Eretz Yisrael through the Midbar. So let's stay in this. This part of Israel, we don't need to conquer, because there's no Canaanim here to have to go to war against, or we don't have to harvest the land and farm and things like that. Instead, we can have all this reality of Israel in the Midbar. And God says that's not true. That's not what it is. Until now, that's the way it had to be. I took you to the Midbar because this was the way to get to Eretz Yisrael. But the pasuk says in Vayikra, I took you out of Eretz Canaan to bring you. I took you. That's later on. I took you out of Eretz Mitzrayim to bring you to Eretz Canaan to be your God. And the Gemara learns from this. You see that God can only really be our God fully in every sense of the term in Eretz Yisrael. End of story. You can argue that point all you want, and you can be angry at me for saying things like that and say, no, it's not true. But that's what it says. That's what all there's no sources to say otherwise. There's no sources to say otherwise. So, when the Jewish people rejected Israel, they rejected God. They rejected, fulfillment. They rejected the base of Mikdash. They rejected all these things that are so central to Judaism. And the Gemara says that because they didn't appreciate that, because they cried for the opposite, they literally, for comfort and not being able to have to, to deal with, conquering the land and taking the land and developing and building up, putting that effort into it, not understanding how wonderful an opportunity that is. For that reason, the 9th of Av became a day of destruction. That's what it says. And everything else, all the sinas chinam, everything, it all flows from this. All the geula rayos, whatever else we did wrong. If the Jewish people had not, well, first with the golden calf, there's no question that began to change things. But if the Jewish people had accepted Israel and gone to the land on schedule the way they were supposed to, we wouldn't have had to make false deals with some of the Canaanim later on, which became thorns in our sides and our eyes, so to speak. We wouldn't have had to eventually be exiled from the land. Everything would have gone the way it's supposed to. There would have been a redemption. There would have been completion. Everything would have been exactly what it's going to be in the Messianic era. Now, having said that, the reality is that, from a Kabbalistic point of view, it's not so simple. It's not so simple. Even the Gemara in Shabbos, for example, says that everybody's born under a particular muzzle. We don't really hold an astrology like the rest of the world might. I'm not talking about the columns in the newspaper. I don't know if it's real astrology, but the real astrology of Avraham Avinu's time, that he himself was able to interpret this, look at the stars, interpret messages, and see this future and things like that. But one of the reasons we don't believe it is not because it's not true, but because of the fact that we can mitigate it. We can't change our muzzle completely. We can change it slightly. We talk about doing things to change muzzle. It doesn't mean completely, because that is our muzzle. There's a certain destiny for every nitzot. There's certain things that are fundamentals that you can't mitigate. It's built in. It's like, deciding after putting a whole skyscraper up to change the foundation. You can change a lot about the sky. You can give it a whole new facade. You can change the interior. You can do lots of things, but changing the foundation, it means taking the whole building down, starting from scratch. So there's certain things you can't change when it comes to you and the world. One of them is your destiny. Everybody has a certain destiny. That's why you just see that some people work so hard to be successful at something, and they're just not. It just doesn't work out. The timing, they don't have haslacha. I think most of us can relate to that to some degree. And some people just seem to have all the muzzle. They call it the Midas touch or the golden touch, right? Yosef, everything he touched turned to gold, so to speak. He was always successful. And the Gemara talks about different mazalos and how to go about deciding your direction in life based upon that. And through tefillah and mitzvahs and tzedakah, you can change certain things. You can mitigate, as I said before, your muzzle. You won't necessarily win all the money from the lottery, but maybe you win some, maybe a little bit, a small token of appreciation from God, that it gives you some of the, but to win the whole thing, it's muzzle in the end. So it's all kind of like built in, and just like people have mazalas, history itself has its own path that it's set on going back to the beginning of history. And even though it's interactive, so that we can have free will, and even though we live with the idea that it's really dependent upon us, that we determine the course of history, not entirely true. It's kind of like, taking driving lessons, where the instructor, he's got his own gas and brake, or at least his brake on his side of the car. And as long as you're driving in a way that he doesn't mind you driving, like as if he's driving, then you can steer the car, and you can put the gas and step in the brake and all that. He's not going to interfere. But the moment that you step outside of the parameters of what he wants, boom, he interferes. He grabs the steering wheel, or he puts his foot on the brake and stops the car immediately, showing you that as much as you had this free reign to have an impact on your driving session, or in this case in history, that really God's got his own pedal, so to speak. And as long as we're working in consonance with what he's planned to do, with his master plan, so then we have that freedom to be part of it. As the Gemara says, that a Kosh Baruch Hu is mezakeh somebody, they have a schus, right? Or is someone who does averas, the Kosh Baruch Hu will have averas, but things will happen through them. As you decide who you're going to be, and then history plays itself out, and God plugs you in based upon your own personal merit. So, in the end of the day, most of the free will that we have is really for the sake of developing ourselves as individuals, either to become spiritually closer to God or to move the other direction, chas v'shalom. And then based upon that, God responds and puts us into, affects our life, accordingly. But. The spies were destined to fail. Was it possible they could succeed? It seems like that is what we're supposed to think and we're supposed to believe. But it was like climbing a steep hill with a huge load on your back. Theoretically, maybe, somehow, miraculously, if you can make it. No, but it has to be within your potential. If you physically can't lift that weight to climb that mountain, you're not going to make it unless God picks you up or someone drags you and you get a rope or whatever. But under the certain conditions as they exist, that's not going to happen. Same thing. When the spies went out to spy the land, it was not the right time of year. If they had gone at another time of year, a better time of year, for example, Adar. Adar is a time of Nisan in the flesh. Certainly Nisan is a great time to go because Nisan is a time of geula, of freedom. It's spring, it's life. It's when God gives us all these wonderful gifts that make us feel better about being in this world, right? The geula took place from Mitzrayim in Nisan. The Gemara says the final redemption will also take place in Nisan. They should have just waited till Nisan. I mean, Nisan had passed that year, so wait another year, right? But don't spy the land during Tammuz and during Av. You know why? Because in the year prior to creation, not the year since creation, but the year prior to creation, that's when God took back the light. You see, creation is an ongoing process of what we call hispashtus and histalkus. These are the Kabbalistic terms. Hispashtus means emanations, and histalkus means withdraw. And when God made creation, right, the light comes down, and then it goes back up. It goes down a little further, and it goes back up. And there's a reason for that. And then if you want, you can look it up. You can write me. I'll be happy to send the material that explains this in more detail. But that's the way he did it. I mean, is that the best way? Yes, because that's the way God did it. Why is it the best way? I mean, there are explanations. But it's kacha. That's why God did it. So in history, you'll find, for the most part, things don't succeed the first time. Anywhere you find success, more than likely it was built upon somebody else's failure or someone else's lack of success. They say this by patents is very, very common. The first guy to take a patent out on an invention rarely makes money. Thing dies. It's a great idea, but as they say, it's before its time. Someone else comes along later on, takes the same thing, buys the patent, whatever, produces a thing, sells it, and makes a fortune. It's spies, right? They went once and they failed. Later on in Yeshua's time, 2 spies go again and they succeed. So you could say, yeah, well, of course they succeeded because the first ones failed. They learned the lesson. But you can still fail the second time too. There can be different problems, whole different set of issues. A lot of times conditions change. So it's not absolutely necessary that the spies succeeded the second time only because the first time failed. No, it could also fail, but it didn't. Because that's the way it seems to work. Down, back, down. Now, but when the light goes down, then you have things like Kabbalah Torah, the splitting of the sea. Essentially, you have revelation of God. Whenever the light's coming into the world, it's on the way down. There'll be a greater sense of spirituality, a greater sense of the presence of God. Like the Mishkan. It says, in this week's Parsha, right, the Shekhinah dwelled upon the Mishkan. It came down. and filled the Mishkan. Everybody felt the reality of God was palpable. It's very hard today to have that. Some people have a little bit of it if you really work hard, but it was like you could it's like the same way you felt your neighbor next to you. You felt the presence of God. It was so real. Histalkus, that we're very familiar with. Anytime there's a war, death, destruction, even though it's for the good, but in the meantime, it's doing bad. The Holocaust, of course, is because there's a major withdrawal of light. Now, sometimes it's automatic, and sometimes we cause it. We seem to cause it, but there's a withdrawal of light. And the period of time that the spies went out, right? There's three stages of it. There's from Rosh Chodesh Av until Tisha B'Av, which we call the 9 days, and then there's the you have after that from you have Yud Zayin Tammuz until Rosh Chodesh. Sorry, you have the within the 9 days you have the period of time that the week that Tisha B'Av falls in. That's more stricter than you have from Rosh Chodesh Av, and then you have the 2 weeks before from Yud Zayin Tammuz. And these, prior to creation, were 3 stages of the light being withdrawn. In fact, when Moshe went up the mountain on the seventh of Sivan, right, the 6th day is Shavuot, because that's when God spoke to the Jewish people and gave them the 10 Commandments. It's the first 2 of the 10 Commandments and spoke to them. Right, Moshe went up the mountain on the 7th day of Sivan. His going up was comparable and really part of this withdrawal of divine light. That's why the Jewish people were so vulnerable to the golden calf later on, because of this withdrawal of light. So this period of time prior to creation actually corresponds to the 3-week period of time that we're told by the rabbis not to do anything dangerous, not to take any risk, not to go to court if we can avoid it, because this is a time when light is being withdrawn from creation every single year. And therefore, we have to be careful and do extra mitzvahs and do whatever we can to try to draw light into the world. And the most intense day, of course, is Tisha B'Av, at which point in time the Histalkus is over and the light comes back again, anew, to rectify creation, and we go into much happier period of time, all the way through to Rosh Hashanah, etc., etc. So this is the basis of the 3 weeks. It's not just that once upon a time we lost track of what we're supposed to do, and therefore we did things we shouldn't have done. And as a result of that, God said enough is enough, and he destroyed the second temple in its time, even though it lasted 420 years. And then before that, there was the first temple, which was followed by the 70 years into exile in Babylonia, which was Persia, also the whole, the 70 years altogether. First exile, and that was because they did terrible things they shouldn't have done. The base pictures are destroyed, and therefore once that happened, then forever after that, it's a day of infamy until Mashiach is born, because apparently Mashiach is going to be born on Tisha B'Av, as they say, tradition says that, and that becomes, of course, the tikkun, the fixing for all of that. It's more than that. Well, there's the spies, right? The spies, what they did, they ruined everything. They went out, spied the land, came back with this evil report, 10 of the 12 spies, and we cried for no reason. So that set in motion Tisha B'Av, as if to say that until that time, Tisha B'Av was a normal day. Nothing new about it, nothing strange about it. No, it's always been that way, going back to prior to Ma'aseh Bereshis, as part of the process of Ma'aseh Bereshis. In fact, that's the period of time during which Shviras HaKelim took place, when God broke the vessels, the original spheres that were in existence before creation. Again, all to make free will possible, to make evil possible. He built something, broke it, in order that creation could be made perfectly imperfect. And now before creation, well, there were things going on that deserve a discussion to themselves, but not like history like we have it today. But it's put into history, and from that point onward, the same way, for example, the Gemara talks about how the 974 generations existed prior to creation. Some people think that shows you that this world was not the first world. No, that's not what it says. That's not what the tradition says at all. People who don't understand it might say things like that, but that's not accurate. Instead, these were pre-creation realities that somehow had free will. Generations does not mean 25, 30 years. It just means like telephones, one after the other, different what do you call it? Gears is different. What's that word? We use generations of phones, and they were part of the creation process too. It wasn't an accident. They weren't expected to live and function like we do in this world. The whole creation was for us, for mankind, since the creation of Adam Rishon. But they're part of the process, part of the creation process, and that has spilled over into history. How? Because it says that they didn't last very. They lasted momentarily. They were all 974 generations were wiped out prior to creation. But they're spiritual beings, spiritual realities. It's complicated. But that's what they were. But they come back. They come back in every generation. The souls of these, whatever they were, these beings from pre-creation, the Gemara says they come back and Hashem puts them in every generation, and they're the most chutzpahdik people, those azus panim people in every generation, these particular souls. So you see that pre-creation spills over to history. And because of that, we're affected. And if you understand this and you know what's going on, you know how to work with it. It's not just simply a case of saying, okay, 3 weeks have begun. Here's the fast that we fasted, got through the day. It's a long day, especially chutzlarts. It's very late, the longest fasts of the year, basically. But it's over. And now we have the 3 weeks, so you can only do certain things, not other things, and just it's like just protect yourself by not doing it. It's much more than that. There's something going on. In fact, in many respects, the 3 weeks represent the greatest opportunity to participate in Tikkun Ma'aseh Bereshis you have all year round. It's always that way. The place with the potential of the greatest destruction is always the potential for the greatest creation, for the greatest Tikkun. So, B'ezras Hashem, we will look a little bit more into that in the next week or so to understand what the opportunity is so that we can take more advantage of it and not only be protected from what's going on in the world around us, but also learn how to transcend it to some degree and do some fixing. Shabbat Shalom.
Well, Rabbi, thank you. Can I ask one question?
Sure.
I know you tried to explain. I mean, you did explain. I tried to understand. You did explain. So if this was a part of pre-creation, these 3 weeks, which are, like, say, darker times or difficult times, or I don't know what else how to describe, is it sort of like a test by Hashem to see how we do, or?
It's always a test. I mean, that's one aspect that we'll address also as Rosh Hashem, like what it means to us. But everything is, you could call it a test, but really it's an opportunity, because the whole point of a test, in school, when you go to school, you need a test because the teacher doesn't know how much you know and how well you know it. Mm-hmm. The only way to reveal your capability is by taking the test and answering the questions. God already knows before you've even taken the test what you can do. He gave you the capability. He knows what you're going to choose. He's above time. So the test doesn't reveal anything to him. So what's the point of the test? It's to reveal things to us. We don't know what we're capable of achieving. We don't know how well we know things. We don't know what we can accomplish. So by definition, everything is a test, but it means that everything is an opportunity to find out more about ourselves and to find out what we're more capable of achieving so we can actualize that. The most tragic thing about history is how many people just drift through life without really paying attention to the opportunities, unless they really hit them over their head. People don't realize what that opportunity is. They have a certain minimal expectation, right? They try to keep up with. Money is a very big determining factor sometimes. Right? If you want to keep a job, you have to work so hard. You want to get a better job to work this hard. If you're learning your yeshiva, you get marks in your. But they don't understand, how the system really works. So that's part of what the 3 weeks comes to do, to teach us that, to educate us, and it turns the whole thing around.
Thank you. I look forward to more. And everybody have a Shabbat Shalom. Good Shabbos, everybody. And thank you so much, Rabbi, for giving us your precious time and your brilliant Torah as usual. Thank you. Good Shabbos, everybody.